When the 1828 election returns came in, Jackson had won handily, taking every state south and west of Pennsylvania. Equally important was the surge in voter turnout. More than twice as many men voted as in the 1824 election. As Andrew Jackson prepared to enter the White House, he was determined to be the people's president. He would launch a new democratic era that would silence his critics, restore government to, quote, the people, and take power away from the Eastern elite. In doing so, he would transform the nation's political landscape, for good and for ill, as it turned out. The inauguration of President Jackson symbolized the democratization of political life. Dressed in a black mourning suit in honor of his recently deceased wife, America's 7th president stepped out of the Capitol building at noon on March 4, 1829. Waiting for him in the cold were 15,000 people who collectively roared and waved their hats when he emerged. "I never saw anything like it before," marveled Daniel Webster, the distinguished senator from Massachusetts. After being sworn in by Chief Justice John Marshall, Jackson mounted his white horse and rode down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House, then called the Executive Mansion, where a wild celebration ensued. The huge crowd of jubilant Western Democrats turned into a drunken mob. A Washington lady marveled at the arrival of frontier democracy in the nation's capital. She said, "What a scene we did witness! The majesty of the people had disappeared, and a rabble, a mob of boys, Negroes, women, children, scrambling, fighting, romping. What a pity! What a pity!" End quote. Andrew Jackson sought to increase the power of the presidency at the expense of the legislative and judicial branches. One of his opponents noted that previous presidents had assumed that Congress was the primary branch of government. Jackson, however, believed that the presidency was superior. "The ruling political and economic elite must be removed," he said, "for the people are the government." And too many government officials had grown corrupt and self-serving at the expense of the public interest. To dislodge the corrupt Eastern political elite, Jackson launched a policy he called rotation in office, whereby he replaced many federal officials with his own supporters. Government jobs, district attorneys, federal marshals, customs collectors belonged to the people, not to career bureaucrats. Democracy, he believed, was best served when newly elected officials appointed new government officials. Such partisan behavior came to be called the spoils system, since as a prominent New York Democrat declared, "To the victor belong the spoils." Andrew Jackson eventually would veto 12 congressional bills, more than all previous presidents combined. Critics claimed that his behavior was monarchical. Jackson, however, believed that the president represented all the people, unlike congressmen who were elected locally. His commitment to nationalism over sectionalism was nowhere more evident than in his handling of the nullification crisis in South Carolina. Vice President John C. Calhoun became President Jackson's fiercest critic, and vice versa. In part, because of his feud with the president, Calhoun had become the leading states' rights advocate for the South. Changing economic conditions in his home state frustrated Calhoun. After the Panic of 1819 and into the 1820s, cotton prices in South Carolina continued to fall. Most South Carolinians blamed their woes on the Tariff of 1828, which taxed British cloth coming into U.S. markets. In doing so, the tariff hurt Southern cotton growers by reducing the demand for raw cotton from America. It also hurt Southerners by raising prices for imported goods. In a pamphlet called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, Calhoun claimed that the Tariff of 1828 favored the interests of New England textile manufacturing over Southern agriculture. Under such circumstances, he argued, a state could nullify or veto a federal law it deemed unconstitutional. Nullification was the ultimate weapon for those determined to protect states' rights against federal authority. As Jackson and others pointed out, however, allowing states to pick and choose which federal laws they would follow would create national chaos. We sort of talked about this a little bit when we talked about Madison and Jefferson's response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, right? Those resolutions that said, well, something that is horrible like this should be able to be declared null and void by the states, and they shouldn't have to follow that federal law. So this is that same kind of idea. That Jackson, like Calhoun, was a cotton-planting slaveholder led many Southerners to assume that the president would support their resistance to the federal tariff. Jackson was sympathetic until Calhoun and others in South Carolina threatened to nullify federal laws. In the fall, I know he looks so surprised, doesn't he? In the fall of 1831, President Jackson tried to defuse the confrontation with South Carolina by calling on Congress to reduce tariff rates. Congress responded with the Tariff of 1832, which lowered rates on some products but kept them high on British cotton fabric and clothing. The new tariff disappointed John C. Calhoun and others eager for the British to buy more Southern cotton. South Carolinians seethed with resentment toward the federal government. In November 1832, just weeks after Jackson was re-elected, a special convention in South Carolina passed an ordinance of nullification that disavowed the unconstitutional federal tariffs of 1828 and 1832, declaring them, quote, null, void, and no law. If federal authorities tried to use force to collect the tariffs on foreign goods unloaded in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina would secede from the Union, they vowed. Calhoun resigned as vice president and became a U.S. senator so that he could defend his nullification theory in Congress and oppose what he thought were Jackson's tyrannical actions. President Jackson's public response was measured and forthright. He promised to use, quote, firmness and forbearance with South Carolina. But he stressed that nullification means, quote, insurrection and war, and the other states have a right to put it down, end quote. In private, however, Jackson was furious. He asked the Secretary of War how many soldiers it would take to go to South Carolina and crush the monster in its cradle. The monster, of course, being nullification. He also threatened to hang Calhoun and other nullifiers if there were any bloodshed. During the fall of 1832, most northern state legislatures passed resolutions condemning the nullifications. Southern states expressed sympathy for South Carolina, but none endorsed nullification. In an official statement to the people of South Carolina, Jackson warned that nullification would lead to secession, and secession meant civil war. Be not deceived by names, he says. Disunion by armed force is treason. Are you really ready to incur this guilt? President Jackson then sent federal troops and a warship to Charleston to protect the federal customs house where tariffs were applied to products imported from Europe. South Carolina's governor responded by mobilizing the state militia. A North Carolina Unionist reported to Jackson that many, quote, reckless and dangerous men were looking for Civil War scenes and bloodshed. While taking forceful actions, Jackson still wanted peaceably to nullify the nullifiers. In early 1833, the president requested from Congress the authority to use the U.S. Army to force compliance with federal law in South Carolina. Calhoun exploded on the Senate floor, exclaiming that he and the others defending his state's constitutional rights were being threatened by what they called the Force Bill. Calhoun and the nullifiers, however, soon backed down, and the South Carolina legislature postponed implementation of the nullification ordinances in the hopes that Congress would pass a more palatable tariff bill, which they did. On March 1, 1833, Jackson signed into law the Compromise Tariff and the Force Bill, the latter being a symbolic statement of the primacy of the Union. Despite the compromise, Southern slaveholders felt increasingly threatened by anti-slavery sentiment in the North. Quote, there is no liberty, no security for the South, groused South Carolina radical Robert Barnwell Rhett. Jackson concluded that the tariff was only a pretext for the nullification crisis and disunion in Southern Confederacy the real object. He continued, the next pretext will be the Negro or slavery question. The 2 days after the nullification crisis was resolved, Jackson was sworn in for a second term as president. And that is the end of part 2. We're going to move into part 3, which is going to talk about some more of the darker aspects of Andrew Jackson's legacy.